take a breath collectively and get over what just happened, by the way, in the realm of politics? I don't know. Well, we'll fill you in, Alex and Ann, in a little bit, but it was a zoo. At any rate, as we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. And we thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is grateful for the opportunity to invite Seattle audiences into present tense exchanges of issues, ideas, and creativity, even when we don't get to, do it in person. Town Hall will continue to produce online content throughout the fall and into the new year, and as circumstances allow, even to host live streams from our building. Meanwhile, if like me, you just can't log enough hours on Zoom or YouTube, know that many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form under the header Digital Media on our website. Back to tonight's event. Program will likely run about 40 minutes, followed by a question and answer session with the audience. Alex and Ann will take questions from the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. Please keep them concise so they can get to as many as possible. Also know that you can view the event both here on Crowdcast or over on our YouTube page if you want to utilize that platform's closed captioning feature. Know that it's also easier for us, though, if you pose your questions back here. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Like tonight's event, one of the upsides of our virtual programs are the extraordinary conversations they make possible. Derek Black with Catherine Dunn about how democracy is weakened when public education is defunded. Michael Ian Black and Mike Birbiglia on how we can redefine masculinity for the next generation of boys. I guess for all people, frankly. Ron Shu and Naomi Ishisaka on the foundational role of Asian Americans in Seattle. Eddie Cole with Sean Scott discussing the influence of college campuses on the struggle for Black freedom. And our digital season makes possible, frankly, even necessary, a reconsideration of presenting music as well. This year's Town Music Chamber Series kicks off this week, actually, with cellist and artistic director Joshua Roman, returning to Seattle for a 10-week residency we're calling Fermata, a celebration of the creative space between face-to-face appointments between artists and audiences, what they conventionally call concerts. Fermata will feature oral and visual glimpses of Joshua's continuum of creativity, composing, practicing, listening, rehearsing, resting, all in the context of this greater cultural and social pause. For more information about Fermata and all the rest, visit townhallseattle.org. Town Hall's work is possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Arts and culture programs in particular come courtesy For Culture, Arts Fund, Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as most of you listening by now know, Town Hall is fundamentally a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight's feed. Newsflash, this is an unprecedented time for nonprofits like Seattle Opera and Town Hall. I urge you to stay connected to the opera's creative fall season and to use this time to get closer to the music and the organization itself. And if you support Town Hall's mission to make ideas and inspiration accessible to the whole community, we hope you will consider joining us as a member or making a donation through the button at the bottom of your screen. Last piece of infomercial. This isn't an easy time for booksellers either, and since we know you will want to spend more time with the ideas in Alex's book, I urge you to buy your own copy here, now, tonight, through our local independent partners at LA Bay Books using the conveniently positioned button at the bottom of your screen. All right. Alex Ross has been the music critic for The New Yorker since 1996. He writes principally about classical music, covering the field from the Metropolitan Opera to the contemporary avant-garde, though he also is featured in that magazine in the larger, slipperier role of cultural critic or public intellectual, as he contributes essays on literature, history, the visual arts, film, and mythology. He was named the MacArthur Fellow in 2008 and a Guggenheim Fellow in 2015, and was also the recipient of an Arts and Letters from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. His first book, the international bestseller, The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won a Book Circle Award. Second book, the essay collection Listen to This, received an Ask Eames Taylor Award. Ann Powers is NPR Music's critic and correspondent. Her books include Good Booty, Love and Sex, Black and White, Body and Soul in American Music, Weird Like Us, My Bohemian America, and Tori Amos's Piece by Piece with the artist herself. She is the co-editor with Evelyn McDonnell of Rock She Wrote, Women Write About Rock, Rap, and Pop, the first published anthology of women music writers. In 2017, she founded Turning the Tables, an ongoing NPR initiative recentering the popular music canon on marginalized, underestimated, and forgotten voices. Alex Ross's book, Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music, is the subject of their discussion tonight. It might be the only thing to recommend this COVID time, frankly, but I have to be honest, I'd never expect I'd be able to utter the words. Please join me in welcoming two of my favorite listeners, Ann Powers and Alex Ross.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Alex.
Hello.
So great. I'm so excited to be here, and welcome to all. I can see you're saying hello in the chat. It's such an exciting thing to be here and talk about this amazing book, which I have read in my Post-it way. I have lots of questions, but I guess the first
hard copy, nice hard copy.
I have a hard copy too,
okay.
but I didn't want to. This one, I love this book so much. You know, you love a book when it's got food stains. I have this. I couldn't let go of it, and I spilled salsa all over it. But I continue to read. I couldn't put it down. So let's. First of all, I know you've been on a virtual book tour, and you've been talking to many different people about this project and the big chunk of your life you've given to this project. But Seattle is a special place. So I know that after we talk, you and I, a little bit, we're going to get some questions from the audience, because Seattle is a Wagnerite town. So it's good to be here in this town. But I want to start by asking about the subtitle of your book, because it's interesting to me that it says art and politics in the shadow of music, and not music in the shadow of politics. In other words, in the story that you share over, century plus, you're talking about sort of music as the force, the grounding and centrifugal force that determines many other artworks, many social movements, or that determines is the wrong word, but that affects and interacts with and is, in dialectical relationship with. So just how did you ground the project in that idea initially, or did that come to you over time?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's just a delight to be here. And of course, I wish I were present in person in Seattle. And it's just wonderful to be with you virtually. Anne, we've known each other for almost 30 years, since our lowly early days as New York Times freelancers. So it's just always a joy to talk with you. But yeah, actually the initial subtitle was Art in the Shadow of Music. And then at a fairly late stage, we added the politics in order to make clear that this was, there obviously ended up being a great deal of politics in the book, and we wanted to sort of indicate that and nod toward that in the subtitle. But yeah, In the Shadow of Music really, for me, connotes, it's Wagner. I mean, so music, the music in question is Wagner. And the idea is that you have this large landscape, a cultural landscape, as well as a political and a social landscape, which in one way or another is shadowed by, is influenced by, is, even just kind of slightly perturbed, in a kind of gravitational way by this force, Wagner, who manifested himself actually not simply in music. And the reason why there was such a phenomenon, I think, at the end of the 19th century revolving around Wagner was that he wasn't just a composer, he was a dramatist, he was a theorist, he was a theater director, he was a conductor, he was a sort of polemicist and campaigner and marketer of his own work. So he was sort of many sort of artistic impulses kind of bundled into one. And I think that's part of why just the influence kind of flashed outward in so many different directions. But it was also just, the period, I think, so the end of the 19th century, it was sort of the heyday, the zenith of this bourgeois religion of art, this idea that the artist can save us. There was a great deal of disappointment in politics in that period, and the failure of the revolutions in 1848, in the sense that somehow artists could lead this great spiritual as well as political transformation. And Wagner offered himself up as the man who could do that. And so it's not just sort of some force emanating from Wagner himself. It's also this urge of the audience and of the community of artists to have some kind of leader, to have sort of someone out there in the forefront showing the way, or maybe reacting against Wagner and going in a quite different direction. But he was just this presence, and so that relationship fascinated me, and this was ultimately why I wanted to write the book, not to write a book about Wagner per se, but to write about this period, which has just fascinated me unduly, since I was unhealthily young, just the fin de siècle of Vienna, and the sort of, this realm of symbolism and early modernism and the occult and all the rest of it, just kind of held me spellbound. And so this was really a way to write about that period through this peculiar lens of Wagner, which I think does give some sort of unexpected perspectives on some quite familiar artists and writers who move through the narrative.
Yes, and you, I mean, the book ranges through so many, absolutely essential works of art and literature, and I want to ask you about even how you manage that. But before we get onto that, there was a phrase that you use. Well, you talk. This is near the end. I was going to talk about this because it comes near the end, but you talk about the love and hate relationship that people have. This kind of, it's truly passionate, emotional, and ideological relationship with Wagner that is never settled. You use words like mutable and unstable and fragile, and I am wondering about that. That sense of engagement with art and how, what it was in Wagner that led to this fiery, passionate, almost romance that people had that was almost as negative as it was positive.
Yeah, that's one aspect of this whole frenzy around Wagner that sort of sets him apart, is this peculiarly personal sort of reaction, and Wagner was just never really on a pedestal. And, when you talk about Bach and Beethoven, or sort of, other towering figures from in other genres and disciplines, Dante and Shakespeare, you just don't have this they just eventually kind of ascend to a level where they're just sort of, that monumental presence, and they sort of, something radiates outward from high on this pedestal. And with Wagner, it was just always, there was always such a fury around him, and that continues. Obviously, he remains a hugely controversial figure. But yeah, these passionate responses, as if, it is like a relationship. It is like sort of the kind of, either platonic or romantic relationship with someone who is fiery and spellbinding, but also intensely irritating or even exasperating and sort of anger-inducing. And so that people were just right from the start, Wagner just got under people's skin in extraordinary ways. So going back to the 1850s, and even before people were hearing the music, they would just read his writings and have these reactions. So he had a gift for just sort of causing a stink, it was sort of a peculiar flair that he had. I don't know whether he consciously sort of manipulated that or not, but just at every stage in his career, there was some kind of crisis, there was some kind of uproar around Wagner. But it is also powerful, to have an artist who sort of manipulates, sort of touches upon, I won't say manipulates, sort of touches upon these deeper emotions. And why that happens, honestly, I'm not sure. There's sort of properties of the music itself. It sort of casts a spell. There's something about the way he uses the orchestra, sort of creates this sort of a sense of hallucination. There's something kind of mesmerizing and hypnotic. But also these are big, complex dramas, and so there's, and they're sort of difficult to sort of make your way into and make sense of. So it's not easy stuff. It's not some sort of trick,
right?
Oral trick. And so he was just a force of nature. He he came out of nowhere in a sense. He didn't, he was sort of an outsider, for a lot of his life, and he imposed himself in a really remarkable way.
The book begins with Wagner's death. I'm spoiler, people, but then of course he reappears.
Apparent death.
He comes back to life, but shortly after his death, you describe his death. You revisit this key relationship he had with another towering figure of German culture and history, Nietzsche, and that's interesting to me because I knew a little bit about the relationship, but I didn't realize it was fraught in the particular way it was. And I think you illuminate the differences between them in a powerful way that might surprise some people who, on the surface, might, have some, see them as if not in lockstep, complementary to each other. Mm-hmm. So I love the personal way you write about their relationship. Like I really have a sense of them. I could almost see their faces, see Nietzsche like with a disappointed, stricken look when Wagner treats him wrong and stuff like that. So talk a little bit about those two, the Bill and Ted. No, that's not right.
Definitely not Bill and Ted.
The bros.
Yeah, well, it's more a father-son kind of relationship.
Yeah, you're right.
Nietzsche was a very young man, this brilliant young philologist sort of comes into his life, worships Wagner, and is just infatuated with the music. But there's also, I think, there's a canniness in terms of they both used each other, because Wagner Wagner made Nietzsche famous, and for his part, Wagner needed to have this kind of intellectual propagandist, almost sort of making the argument for his work in this free-for-all, this sort of intensely combative arena of German cultural life and intellectual life. But there was a strong bond between them, and Nietzsche described it as a love affair, or almost as a love affair. He had that phrase, and then he struck it out from one of his manuscripts. But so a sort of father and son kind of just very intense bond, and then it broke, and it had to break, because Nietzsche had to establish his independent voice. There was just no way that someone with his fiery personality could continue to play this subservient role, to the point where just Wagner would send him on errands and sort of go get some caramels and sort of silk undergarments and sort of these various things. And so it had to explode. But it wasn't just a personal break. I mean, there was actually a serious philosophical disagreement which emerged between the two of them. And I think that is what is most intensely revealing, is sort of where they disagreed with each other and how those disagreements sort of forecast forking paths in German history in a quite significant way. And so, one topic was about power and sort of the cult of power. And especially in later years, Wagner was promoting a philosophy of compassion, sort of almost a pacifist kind of philosophy, which emerged in his final opera Parsifal, whereas Nietzsche was sort of full of this idea of to define the will to power is quite complicated, and I won't try to do that. But there was a certain kind of cult of power with Nietzsche, and they disagreed about slavery. And Nietzsche would say that slavery, defined in a very sort of abstract, universal way, was perhaps necessary to a society. You needed this severe hierarchy of masters and slaves, and Wagner rejected that idea absolutely, which puts Wagner in a good light. We can look ahead to how these forces will play out in future German history. But on the other hand, Nietzsche was disgusted by Wagner's anti-Semitism. He was disgusted by this sort of imperial German chauvinism, and sort of that was a breaking point between them. And Nietzsche's attitude was more cosmopolitan, and the idea of the good European and so on. And so that makes Nietzsche look more favorable. And what I say ultimately is when you combine them together, when you take away the sort of favorable aspects of each of these personalities, and when you sort of combine the negative aspects, you actually have a kind of recipe for fascism. You have sort of the intellectual roots of fascism coming together, but not in either one of them in isolation. It's sort of this combination, which is exactly the kind of combination that Nazism and the ideologists who led the way toward Nazism, they performed exactly this kind of fusion of Nietzschean and Wagnerian ideas. But it's poignant to contemplate the fact that, if this conversation could have gone on, if they could have somehow reasoned with each other and sort of come to sort of show each other sort of the error of the other's ways, there was just a conversation that never happened.
I think the pop cultural reference I should have made is the Biggie and Tupac of that era, perhaps.
Right,
because,
maybe so.
Like, as you're saying, if the conversation could have gone on, but yet it couldn't. Although it did in other people's hands for decades.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Today.
But no, this is the springboard for the book. This is the first chapter I go into, I sort of set out this sort of Nietzsche Wagner break in the context of the Ring cycle, just as a way to sort of introduce Wagner himself and sort of cluster of ideas around Wagner. And then we start to sort of go off the deep end as these other kinds of Wagnerisms begin to flourish and sort of take the meaning of this work in very different directions.
Well, there's an interesting dynamic throughout the book, and I do want to talk about structure a little bit, but one aspect of the structure of the book is this dynamic between cosmopolitanism and the world Wagner, the European Wagner mostly, but later the American Wagner and the world Wagner, and through cinema, really, the universal Wagner, and then the German Wagner, and the role that his work plays in the shaping of the German consciousness and politic after his death. And how did you balance those elements? Because I found it fascinating to read how the symbolists interacted with Wagner, or rediscover Virginia Woolf's connections, or obviously Willa Cather. You have a beautiful chapter on Willa Cather. So I'm curious about that, like the Wagner who ranges, like as if in the ring itself, and the one who stays in.
Yeah. Well, this is sort of the central balancing act of the book, and this is what I just constantly struggled with, sort of find the right balance. Because part of me is someone who loves Wagner's music, and when I listen, I can sort of find my way into this sort of personal response, especially to the psychological richness of these characters, which feels as though it has very little to do with this dark history which unfolded. And part of me wants to just celebrate the proliferation of sort of all these wonderful, wacky varieties of sort of people responding to Wagner from the far left, side of the political spectrum, and gays and lesbians and African Americans and Catalan and Irish artists and America and so on and so forth, and all the way to Japan, and just sort of this wonderful carnival. I sometimes thought of it as like a sort of theme park of fantasy decadence. But I can't just do that, because there is also this other current moving forward, which is not broadening and growing ever more diverse. It's actually narrowing, becoming ever more strictly defined, ever more sort of monomaniacal in focus in terms of sort of this German nationalism and anti-Semitism, and that just sort of gathers force. And so I was trying to sort of keep these things in balance, sort of show these developments sort of unfolding simultaneously, and it is a very complicated picture, and you sort of have to keep sort of shifting registers as you go back and forth between these different processes unfolding. But the way that it all makes sense is that fundamentally this is an artwork which can be infinitely reinterpreted in sort of different people's minds and in different contexts. But at the same time, it is playing a role in history, in society, in politics, and there its effects end up being sort of much narrower in focus. And so sort of the sort of broad cultural reception on the one hand versus the sort of stricter sort of political sort of train of consequences, and that it almost felt in the end as in the early stages especially, I was just wallowing in all of this sort of absurd eccentricity of responses to Wagner, and it was really kind of a sort of joyous stage of the process. And as I went along, and as the Nazi period loomed closer, I felt that it ultimately becomes a tragic narrative, and maybe the reader will feel this as well. This sense of possibility, this incredibly rich proliferation of responses is undermined and curtailed through a series of events that begin with Wagner, and for which Wagner has a very definite degree of responsibility. And so it felt all the more crushing, when I arrived at the Nazi chapter and the full consequences became clear, and I think maybe for readers will feel that as well, even though it's not the end of the story, and Wagnerism does continue sort of proliferating sort of right until today. But it's a complicated structure, just because there are so many different personalities involved. Just the cast of characters is a bit absurd.
Speaking about that, the tragedy is also one of a mismanaged or perhaps too well managed legacy by family members. And first I want to say structurally, there's a very interesting thing that happens where the Nazi encounters and they use that part of the book is like dead center in the book, yet it never overtakes the rest of the book. I think it's very beautifully handled in terms of that. It doesn't feel like this inevitable drive to this moment. There's all this other stuff happening. It's almost like there's kind of these hyperlinks out to all these different possible realities, and then we get this reality, and then we move out of it. And I do want to note that you call your section on post 1945 the wound, which I think is interesting. But let's talk about the legacy and the role of Wagner's family. And is this a tragedy, a kind of a Eugene O'Neill tragedy of a fallen family as well?
Well, it was. It's just the story of the family itself is such an epic, tragic epic, or sort of quite awful story in a lot of ways. It was actually Karl Marx remarked that the complex sort of sexual shenanigans of the Wagner family could be told as in a tautology, as in a sort of epic ring cycle, and that was at a very early age. He didn't know he knew only a little of it at that stage. There was a lot more to come in terms of this insane family, but the family had a lot to do with the shaping of Wagner's image. Beginning with Cosima Wagner, who was an extraordinary personality, and she's kind of she keeps cropping up again and again in the book, and I'm fascinated by her. She was she's just kind of this cold diva kind of figure who exerted extraordinary influence, and she was remarkable in that she was very powerful, sort of for a woman in this period to be running a major festival, directing everything, administrating, sort of making these decisions. I mean, she was a formidable figure, and I think not to be dismissed. And sort of a cartoon of Cosima as this reactionary who is just sort of preserving her husband's ideas, as if embalmed or something. And no, she had her own. She was a brilliant, deeply cultured woman who created her own Wagner in a sense, almost as a revenge on a man who was extremely irresponsible and oppressive in a lot of ways as a husband. And she, I think, even in the last years of his life, was helping to create this patriarchal, this majestic patriarchal figure of sort of hero of German national culture, which is not who Wagner was at all. Wagner was this odd,
impish,
restless, clownish kind of just
jumping around.
Jumping up she got rid of all that. She fixed a very different kind of image, and she perpetuated it. And then the sort of the other members of the family. I mean, she herself was, of course, not German at all. She was half French, half Hungarian, and then their son Siegfried, who took over the festival, married a British orphan, Winifred Williams, who became the notorious Winifred Wagner. So the ironic thing is that by the time you get to the Nazi period, the family is sort of less and less German. With each generation, and then Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the utterly kind of malignant Houston Stewart Chamberlain, enters the picture and marries into the family, and makes Bayreuth the center of his racist philosophizing. So all of this colors the image of Wagner very heavily. And what it does is, the anti-Semitism, of course, is absolutely there at the center. It was just a obsession of Wagner decade after decade. And it would, you can't say that the family exaggerated it, or accentuated it. But what they did was they fixed on that aspect of Wagner. They fixed on the German nationalism, and they excluded a lot of these other traits, the more cosmopolitan side of Wagner, the Wagner who was went through phases of being a kind of anarchist or socialist or sort of otherwise not really believing in the organized state, could be quite anti-militarist in his thinking. So they just made him over as this, grand imperial figure, suitable ultimately for sort of transformation into the Nazi sort of hero of Nazi culture. But there had to be this sort of airbrushing that went on, and the family participated very heavily. And then, of course, the family became friends with Hitler at a quite early stage, and cultivated him and helped him rise to power.
Well, you also reveal, however, the fascinating detail that Hitler himself, while completely wrapped up in Wagner and using Wagner's work, as you said, and being promoted by the family, he never directly connected with Wagner's anti-Semitic writings in his own writings. Like, it seems in a way that you make a good case that Hitler was not as intellectually influenced by Wagner as people say he was. I don't know. I mean, he was like using Wagner instead, or he was emotionally affected, and he used Wagner, but his ideology came from somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's easy to sort of overstate this case, because there's actually a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't know about sort of Hitler's early intellectual development, sort of political development. He was just a completely obscure figure the whole first part of his life. But the fact is, it is striking, and it was actually Saul Friedlander who was one of the first to point this out, that not only in sort of Wagner's, in Hitler's writings, in Mein Kampf and so forth, but in none of the speeches, really in none of the recollections of other people recalling his conversation, or the table talk conversations that were recorded during the war. He never brought up he never quoted from Wagner's anti-Semitic writings, and he never really alluded to it. Goebbels did, other Nazi figures did, but Hitler didn't. And you can easily read too much into that. I mean, obviously he was aware of Wagner's anti-Semitism, funny that I keep confusing them. But the fact that he didn't feel compelled to mention it says to me that ultimately Wagner was not a major influence on his purely on his political development, and that he fell in love with Wagner's music long before he had any discernible political opinions at all. And sort of he stayed at a certain remove, and that was just the kind of relationship that he had with this work. And it's not surprising, because if you were to attempt to sort of bring the details of Wagner's politics into the picture, it gets very complicated, because it's just wildly contradictory, and even the nature of his anti-Semitism didn't fully align with this purely biological, pseudoscientific Nazi anti-Semitism. So it was more useful for Hitler to preserve this general image of Wagner as the great German cultural hero, and in fact, it was, I think, nonetheless, he was able to use Wagner very effectively, in that role, and it was probably just sort of more powerful to have him sort of somehow benignly looking down, on Nazism, as opposed to being sort of cited line by line. And then there were Nazis who had problems with Wagner, and saw him as a dubious, decadent figure. There were rumors that Wagner was Jewish himself, and those circulated.
And that he was gay.
Period. Yeah, the sort of the well-attested gay atmosphere at Bayreuth, which was being noted already at the end of the 19th century, and written about, which is remarkable. I have a book right here. This is a book that came out in 1899, I think. This is a reprint, obviously, Richard Wagner and Homosexuality by Hans Fuchs, and 1903. And so, yeah, this was discussed at length, and the relationship between King Ludwig and Wagner, and the sort of quasi-romantic letters that they wrote back and forth to each other, was for some people a sign that Wagner was, maybe not just an ally, but one of us. They thought this may have been a gay relationship, which it certainly wasn't. But there was an aspect of Wagner himself, and then the atmosphere at Bayreuth after his death, which was friendly to gay men and lesbians. It was sort of known to be a safe gathering place, and so by the time you get to the Nazi period, that was viewed as quite suspect.
You have a wonderful chapter about Venusberg that discusses what you're talking about now, as well as artists of color and writers of color who were Wagnerites, women. And I know you made some discoveries. You made one important discovery. I remember in Seattle one time, you and I went to the symphony together, and you had just found you'd uncovered some things about an African American diva who was part of your story. So can you share?
Yeah, that was very exciting, because this was, I haven't made too many sort of contributions to the sum of human knowledge. I'm sort of a commentator more than a sort of first-hand researcher. But this was kind of new. The story that I uncovered with Lorana Aldridge, who is the daughter of Ira Aldridge, the great New York-born actor who went to London when he was a teenager, became a well-known actor in England, and then starting in the 1850s, he started having this extraordinary career on the continent, playing many Shakespeare roles, not just the obvious Othello, but also King Lear and Richard III, and became enormously famous. And he came through Zurich, and Wagner probably saw him in Zurich in 1857. And then he had a number of gifted children, and one of them, Lorana, was a rising contralto, low-voiced singer with apparently an extraordinary voice. Charles Gounod said that it was one of the most beautiful voices he had ever heard. And she ended up being cast to sing one of the Valkyries at Bayreuth in 1896, cast by Cosima Wagner.
Which you discovered that, right? You uncovered
yeah, well,
this.
There were sort of references sort of here and there in footnotes, very in brief sources, and also in the biography of her father, Ira Aldridge, by Mildred Stock and Herbert Marshall. But it was just unclear exactly what had happened. Had she sung at Bayreuth? And there's sort of this passing reference. But I was able to sort of dig up much more of the story by going through newspapers in the period, and also by going to the archives at Northwestern of her sister Amanda. And there I discovered this incredible letter from Cosima Wagner to Lorana Aldridge after the 1896 festival, in which she did not sing because she fell sick, and her career was ultimately curtailed because she had very severe medical problems. But Lorana had written to her, sort of seeing, well, can I come back and sing at Bayreuth? I've recovered, and Cosima wrote back this elegant, somewhat condescending, but very civilized, very respectful letter, saying, unfortunately, it's too late. Our personnel is complete. It's written in English, and Cosima spoke perfect English, and sort of hoping, you'll continue to develop as a singer and go to a good teacher so as to properly manage your voice. Some kind of suggestion that maybe she needed some further stage of sort of managing her voice. But just a remarkable document of this relationship between a mixed race singer and the director of the Bayreuth Festival, who apparently became such close friends with Eva Wagner, the daughter, that she moved into Wahnfried, into the house. And there's notes that I found also from Eva Wagner. This is the same woman who ended up marrying Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the master philosopher of Aryan
Nazis.
Supremacy and antisemitism. So it's bizarre. It's sort of difficult to get your head around, but it expresses exactly the complexity, the irreducibility of Wagner's sort of multiple position in cultural terms and in political terms. That on the one hand, you can have him inflaming the imagination of someone like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, but at the same time, W.E.B. Du Bois is bewitched by Wagner's music, and this tradition actually begins of great Black singers engaging with Wagner, going on through Simon Estes, Grace Bumbry, Jesse Norman, who was an incredible Wagner singer, and Eric Owens and several others today. So it's and there are several scholars who are working on this question of Black Wagnerism or Afro Wagnerism, and it's not a huge phenomenon, but it does exist, and it's not just Du Bois. It's also Alan Locke and even Langston Hughes seem to have a sort of weakness for Wagner, and Shirley Graham, later Shirley Graham Du Bois. So it's a sort of unexpected kind of rich sort of layer of cultural history to sort of zero in on.
Well, one thing that struck me throughout the book, thinking about other books that kind of have the heft and scope of yours, I think about Greil Marcus and Lipstick Traces, and how many critics have kind of employed the technique that he used in that book of finding metaphorical or sort of, what's the word, associative connections that aren't really grounded in history. And he found, when he compared punk to Dada and saw connections, put a picture of Hugo Ball next to a picture of Johnny Rotten or something like that. And that kind of, led many of us, including myself, down certain roads as critics. But with Wagner, I mean, you are dealing with artists all throughout the span of your book who are not, these are not lipstick traces. These are like active love-hate, as we said, very, opinionated relationships that these artists are having. And I was curious if you ever found yourself frustrated with, say, the way that Tolkien engaged with Wagner, or, like, hey, Thomas Mann, I didn't think you were right about this. Like, because it's such an active relationship with almost every artist has, as opposed to just like, oh, perhaps an influence. I wondered how
Right.
you yourself, like here you are responding. You have your own feelings and your own ideas about Wagner. How was that for you to deal with these so many perspectives?
Yeah, no, I loved it. I mean, sort of each of these figures, sort of giant figures, engaging with
Yeah.
Wagner in their own way. Sometimes eccentrically. Sometimes you're just sort of looking at a reference as well. That's not quite what happens in Act 2 of Wagner. You know, but the idea is not to correct it. You know, sort of
Right.
step of, actually, Marcel Proust.
That's what I was wondering. You're like, come on.
But that's not the point. The point is, you know, it's, you know, what they focus on and sort of how they incorporate it into their art. It works both ways for me in this incredibly exciting way. On the one hand, it sort of casts this new light back on Wagner to be listening through their ears, but also, you know, their own work to be looking at this whole series of figures through this funny lens of just only talking about sort of how they relate to Wagner is just sort of revealed all kinds of new layers. Or even just provided sort of a way into, you know, I tried to read The Waves by Virginia Woolf a number of times over the years, and I found it very difficult. And when I finally sat down and sort of had my kind of Wagner rubric in front of me, somehow I got it. And it wasn't necessarily because of the Wagners, just because I sort of had something to focus on, you know, and I just ended up completely falling in love with the book, and I sort of made my way through Fitting Its Wake kind of with the same determination, maybe not always with the same level of pleasure, because it's just very
you really took on a lot with this book.
Well, that was the chapter, like the one chapter which is just sort of completely out of control is the one that is Ulysses, the Wasteland, the Waves, and Fitting Its Wake.
I know. It's just like,
it's too much,
dude.
You know. But in fact, these are, you know, as you say, they're specific. You know, they aren't random references. These are rooted in real experiences and personal experiences of the music.
Yes,
that there was some exposure that T.S. Eliot had in his youth to Wagner. We can't quite put our finger on it, sort of when it was and what it was, and this implication that this intense, almost romantic friendship with Jean Verval had something to do with it. But it's there, you know. It's just, and Stravinsky, of all people, was talking to T.S. Eliot and came up with the impression that this experience with Tristan was incredibly important to him and was just very deeply set. And I guess he only revealed that to Stravinsky, no one else. And Joyce, you know, these intense experiences with Joyce and Virginia Woolf's somewhat more detached, but I think quite sort of, there was just something very industrious about sort of, she kept going back to Wagner and kept sort of trying to figure out what this figure meant to her. And sometimes it was very positive and sometimes sort of strongly dismissive, and often had to do with the male figures in her circle and their relationship, their obsession with Wagner. And she was observing that as well as sort of having her own relationship with the music. And sort of there's the critique of the male writer voice, the sort of male artist voice is sort of part of that as well. But I just found this, I mean, it was just, for years and years, I just didn't really want to finally get going in terms of the writing of the book and sort of really moving forward, because I was just enjoying this re-education so much, you know. So always one more, you know, always one more Cather story to read and one more peculiar sort of French novel to sort of investigate. And I just hope that, you know, for readers, they can sort of share in that, the sort of joy that I had to some extent.
Well, I did. I mean, I found it. So I found reading the book something of a re-education, revisiting so many of these essential texts that you know, maybe I haven't picked up in a long time or thought about. I mean, as a women's studies minor at University of Washington as an undergrad, I had been into the waves, but you know, thinking about re-engaging with Virginia Woolf again, and I that's one thing I recommend to everyone out there watching. This is why you're going to love this book, because it is a new lens on such a wide range of essential cultural and artistic processes and artifacts. And that's what's so wonderful about it. And we haven't even gotten to the post 1945 Wagner, and
Right.
I know pretty soon we have a few questions, so I want to turn to those. But I will ask about that quickly and say, first of all, your use of the metaphor of the wound, kind of the stricken Wagner, the changed Wagner post Nazism, and then also I would say simultaneously the Wagner who, in popular culture and cinema specifically, becomes both a signal of the sublime and of kitsch at the same time, which is kind of what, if I had time to ask you about Bayreuth, that seems like Bayreuth is that same thing. But
Right.
but anyway, what is, how, just 5-minute response on post 1945, how Wagnerism comes out of that moment that could have annihilated its influence.
Yeah, it's a
didn't.
remarkable story. I mean, there was this renaissance of Wagner after 1945, at the very moment where you thought we're done with this man, forever. But what happens is, and partly it has to do with the tenacity of the Wagner family again, and so now it's the grandsons, Wieland and Wolfgang, putting together a kind of facade of a modernized and denazified Bayreuth, which covered up a great deal of dark family history, including their own, because Wieland especially was very close to Hitler. They had a relationship, as sort of Hitler was some kind of foster father to him almost. It's a bit. There's one very creepy photograph in the book of Hitler with the two grandsons.
In the window, he's like in the window. That's a crazy
Wieland
photograph.
they both have cameras and they're photographing Hitler. So there was that, but they succeeded in sort of pushing all that aside and sort of creating the illusion that they started over from scratch. But at the same time, Wieland was a great theatrical director, and he did find a startling and powerful, highly abstract, but also intensely dramatic way of staging Wagner with this incredible cast, these casts of Wagner singers. And for me, the greatest Wagner recordings, or certainly some of the greatest, are from the 1850s, 1950s at Bayreuth, with Astrid Varnay and Hans Hotter and Martha Mödel and Wolfgang Wingas, and they're so intense. You can just feel how just there's this everything has just been revivified, and people have found this powerful, new, cohesive, kind of organic sort of way of singing Wagner under Wieland's direction, and so this sort of took off from there, and then you have the successive wave of reconceptions and revisionist, ever more radical restagings of Wagner by East German directors, by Patrice Chéreau at Bayreuth in 1976, and then sort of this increasingly wild and diversified series of stagings, a lot of which has driven people up the wall, and some of it is extreme and absurd, but it's also absolutely necessary. And the Chéreau production of The Ring, which I recommend, for me it's just one of the essential documents of Wagner on recording, it's just a magnificent. It reveals this grand political allegory of The Ring in a way that had never really been done before, and so suddenly Wagner is enriched, and there's this sort of new focus on the leftist Wagner, and sort of almost this kind of new wave of Wagnerisms as you saw at the turn of the century. But then, there's increasing focus on anti-Semitism, and on the possibility of anti-Semitism within the operas themselves. The unofficial ban on Wagner in Israel. There's this increasing consciousness of that particular role that Wagner played as, unfortunately, a leading, anti-Semitic thinker in the late 19th century. And so sort of the sort of reputation sort of tips back and forth. But then you're right, it's just to have happening at the same time as this brooding kind of European deep engagement and reevaluation and kind of argument over what is left of Wagner in Hollywood and in fantasy culture more broadly, intentionally or not, all of these old kind of Wagnerian mythic themes just spring back to life, and they're just suddenly everywhere. The ring of power, the sort of magic swords, and cursed wanderers, pirates of the Caribbean, and this sort of this Parsifal kind of allegory in the Matrix, and it's in some cases it's deliberate. I mean, Tolkien certainly knew his Wagner. In other cases, it's a sort of indirect kind of chain of influences, and but it is interesting. All this is sort of happening simultaneously. This kind of grand mythic sort of kitschy reinvention of Wagner, along with this sort of deep probing kind of European investigation of sort of the wreckage of the old Wagnerism. So that chapter ended up being, at first I thought that sort of the whole story, I wouldn't be able to fill a chapter with sort of Wagnerism after 1945, because I just felt like it was all just kind of going to peter out. And I ended up with maybe the most overstuffed chapter in the whole book, because there is so much to talk about, and I'm squeezing a fairly big span of time into one chapter.
And even today, of course, there's been amazing productions just in the 2000s of Wagner. And I will close my last question, then I'll turn to the questions from the audience. Do you have any favorite moments from Seattle productions of Wagner over the years?
Well, I'm embarrassed to say I never made it to the Seattle.
No. Well, there'll be future chances.
Which is very bad, and there were several occasions where I was supposed to come or about to come, and I couldn't. But I know it's a great tradition, and I think this is. Well, I mean, talk about your experience of the ring.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, it's. I was thinking about it before we got together tonight. And, growing up in Seattle and then being in high school, this is not a production, but this speaks to the question of Wagner kitsch, because there was this poster for Tristan and Isolde that is very famous, of these two lovers intertwined. I can't even say who someone in the chat could probably say, but I think that poster made me want to go to the opera, period. Because it was so, like, in it, you could feel the elemental relationship between those two. And I was not disappointed when I saw Tristan here. And I also saw an incredible production of Parsifal here, and wanted to note that in your book, Parsifal is kind of a foil for so many other elements of Wagnerism. And you keep coming back to Parsifal as a counterpoint to Wagner's worst tendencies, and the hope of the book is, a lot of it is sort of located in the story of Parsifal, I feel, and compassion.
Yeah. I mean, not that Parsifal doesn't have sort of deep, sort of sinister elements.
Got some issues
within it.
It's got some issues.
But there is something. It is a remarkable piece. It endlessly fascinates me, because I feel like I've never figured it out. The ring, I sort of have a general handle on what the ring is about. Of course, when I sort of zero in, there's always sort of new surprises and sort of elements to it. Tristan I have a general kind of sense of it. Parsifal, I just don't know. I don't know if Wagner himself ultimately had any idea what was going on in that opera, but it is this labyrinth, and it does have this tremendous kind of spiritual basis, whatever Wagner himself actually felt, or however faithfully he himself fulfilled these spiritual ideas in his own life. He was weaving together strands from Christianity, from Buddhism, from other Eastern traditions, paganism, in a way that resonates and can just sort of unleash a sort of spectacular kind of effects in the right hands. And I end the book with Parsifal. Before the epilogue, I finished my examination of sort of the cinematic history of Wagner with Werner Herzog and Terrence Malick, and both of them use Parsifal in very different contexts from what I think we're used to with Wagner in Hollywood, and the way Herzog pairs Parsifal with these horrifically beautiful images of burning oil fields in Kuwait, and the sort of this sort of wreckage of this war and this sort of devastated landscape. And Malick, I think, even more piercingly uses Parsifal in To the Wonder in this extremely personal context of it comes back to psychology and the individual and sexuality, the sense of really kind of sin and redemption, or sort of sexual woundedness and recovery, and sort of seeking a way out. And it's and it feels so startlingly new, to have the Parsifal music sort of playing in the background of that sort of contemporary wounded love story. And I use the word wounds, because this is the Parsifal word. This is what Parsifal exclaims when Kundry kisses him, and he suddenly understands the nature of Amfortas's wound. And the nature of Amfortas's suffering and his sin, and sort of his having strayed from the way of the chaste order. But it's the moment of compassion. It's the moment of empathy. And that's a very elemental human thing that I think you can't take away from Wagner, because he expressed it in the most, I think, visceral and compelling way in the middle of that very complicated and strange final opera.
Well, let's take some questions from the audience. We'll start with one from Phil Brandt. Phil writes, in Tristan, the question just jumped, another one jumped in, but okay, back to Phil. In Tristan, Wagner brilliantly highlighted suspension of harmonic resolution until the huge release at the very end. Claude Debussy was intimately familiar with Tristan, and he took the idea of harmonic suspension in new directions. To what degree do you think Debussy, in spite of protestations, was influenced by Wagner?
Oh, very much so. And I think he would have admitted this himself. There's sort of this performance of breaking away from Wagner, but there's just no doubt that Wagner was of deep value to him to the end of his life. And this is something that, the topic of Wagner's influence on music and on subsequent composers is a huge, rich subject, which I actually don't take on in this book, because I just to simplify matters a little bit and to sort of confine, the narrative that otherwise would have been, endlessly long. And also because it's the non-musical influence, which is just so unusual, in Wagner's case.
Yes.
But Debussy, Debussy very much relates to this French. If I were to have had a full discussion of Debussy in the book, it would be in the context of Baudelaire and Mallarmé and this particular French response to Wagner, which focused on Wagner as dream state, Wagner as kind of this window, the sort of threshold into an unconscious realm. The forest of symbols. This idea of sort of wandering in a forest, a kind of the sort of dark flow of consciousness, sort of unconsciousness, and the idea that all that is sort of welling up to the surface. And this is the effect of Tristan, that at a certain point you're no longer on the surface. It's not about action. It's not about physical action, especially in Act 2 of the opera. Everything is stopped, and you're in this sort of turbulent kind of, inner world of pure emotions that are going back and forth. And that's really the sort of the whole opera, is like the exterior reality is just sort of pushed to such a distance that it's utterly shocking when it comes back in, and there's these incredible shocks. There's there's a king, and people are watching. And so where was I going with all this? Yeah, so Debussy, it's the French just kind of take that ever further, this and sort of symbolism as a movement really grows out of Wagner in a very specific kind of way. And, to the extent that Debussy is part of that movement, and I think actually he's probably better. It's difficult to label him at all, but I think it would be more logical to call him a kind of symbolist composer than an impressionist composer. But yeah, and he takes away that final resolution, often, in his music. You never have that final great kind of, sinking back into the major key. You stay floating forever. And that's sort of the Debussy revolution. But the orchestration is completely different, and the sort of the scale is completely different. But yes, Debussy could not have become who he was, I think, without that impulse from Wagner, and I think he would have been the first to say so.
From Kathleen, we have the question. I think you sort of addressed some of this, but could you please address the issue of more recent cultural rejection of Wagner and Barenboim's place in reintroducing Wagner to wider concert halls?
Mm-hmm. Well, by rejection, is that the Wagner in Israel, or
yes, I don't know, because I just have the question. This is the disadvantage of the Zoom.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll sort of assume that this is about Wagner in Israel. And Barenboim, did attempt to bring Wagner to performance in Israel, as did Zubin Mehta, causing enormous controversy, and sort of Wagner remains just sort of more or less out of bounds in Israeli music life today. For me, Barenboim, he is one of the great Wagner conductors that we have right now. And, he has, I think, he's tried to reassert a sort of sense of Wagner's universality, and sort of counterbalancing the focus on Wagner as proto-Nazi, as sort of progenitor of Hitlerism, a sort of more universal kind of image of what Wagner is about, and sort of specifically sort of argued against the limitations of seeing Wagner purely or primarily, as a sort of as a figure who points toward Nazism. I mean, I think that's a necessary argument to make. There is a counter argument to it as well, and I think for me, it's always about the balance. I mean, if I'm with a group of people who say that Wagner is just absolutely satanic, and Hitler could not have existed without Wagner, and that he somehow sort of caused the Holocaust, I'm going to argue against that, because I find that simplistic, and it actually the causes of Nazism and the Holocaust go far deeper than Wagner, and to somehow sort of try to shift all the blame onto him it's just inadequate to sort of assessing kind of where this human evil came from, because it goes back long before Wagner. But if I'm with a group of people who say like, ultimately Wagner can be separated, from this dark history, and the music is just so magnificent in itself that it sort of pushes everything else to the side. That I will also argue with. It's just, for me, it's just always about finding the balance with Wagner and with everything else. I mean, this is just, for me, the idea of separating art from history, from society, is just kind of alien to the way I experience it. Just from when I was a kid, I always wanted to know, what were the lives of these composers like, and sort of where did the music come from? And you make uncomfortable and profoundly unsettling discoveries, as you reveal the full history. But it's necessary, and it enriches the experience. It complicates the experience in a way that I think you sort of ultimately get more out of it when you really honestly try to confront everything behind, not just Wagner, but I mean, Walter Benjamin said it best. There's no document of civilization that is not at the same time a document of barbarism, and we can find the darkest human forces behind every great and sublime work of art. And it doesn't spoil. I mean, for me, it doesn't spoil the work, to be conscious of it. It's just necessary. It's just something.
I mean, I feel that that's why it's so important that this book came out now. And of course, you couldn't have planned the moment, and you wouldn't have planned this moment. But in light of the reckoning that's happening, the cultural reckoning with American history, culture, and texts, with the legacy of slavery embedded in so many essential or texts that have been deemed essential, works that have been deemed essential in American history, the same process as what you're going through, what you went through with this book. You've created a model for people to consider that,
well, there are other very good models for looking at questions of systemic racism and culture. But the thing about Wagner is, I mean, this has been going on for so long, and people have been contending with this problematic figure for so long, that there is just such a rich history in itself of people struggling with and finding their own way through this kind of maze of problems, and in that sense, Wagner becomes a kind of model, I think, for how you deal with a complicated figure like this. You keep him on stage, you continue to perform him, but you find ways of staging him that either bring these problems directly to the surface or place him in some entirely new context that counteracts that sort of points away from the sort of implications of the older history, without attempting to erase it. We're just sort of here's just a different way into this work. And so I think this, I kept thinking, especially toward the end, final stages of the book, what we as Americans can learn from, about our own culture and the way our own culture has been enmeshed in power, in white supremacy and systemic racism, and the sort of drive toward global hegemony, the sort of fusion of culture and capitalism. I think we have an unfortunate tendency as Americans to sort of view these kinds of problems as European problems, and they're the ones with this dark, menacing history that sort of shadows, all of their great art. But it's entirely our story as well, going back very, very far, and just present in so much of the culture that we prefer to think of as innocent and sort of earthbound and sort of purely all American kind of up from the roots kind of culture. It's all embedded in very similar ways. So maybe this story as well can sort of serve as a model for some of that grappling with the darker themes of our own past. That was very much on my mind toward the end.
We have a question from Rat King Deluxe. I heard a discussion the other day about the opposing philosophies of Liszt and Wagner. Liszt granting more agency to the performer, and Wagner granting complete agency to the scorer/composer. Do you know of any contact between the two composers? I think there's an incident in the book where they're both in some, or is Liszt at Bayreuth, and there's something about his flowing hair, and the women comment. And did they ever publicly discuss their differences of opinion? Rat King asks.
Well, no, they were very closely enmeshed in all kinds of ways. For one thing, Cosima was Liszt's daughter, so Liszt was Wagner's father-in-law. But even well before that scandalous affair began, which turned into Wagner's second marriage, Liszt and Wagner were extremely close. Especially around 1850 when Wagner had to go into Wagner went into exile in 1849 as a revolutionary. Liszt took up his cause in a very strong way and presented the premiere of Lohengrin in Weimar, and so the two were very closely bound together. Their differences, I think, were probably more ones of personality. They had a very difficult relationship, especially with the affair with Cosima caused problems, and just Wagner's personality caused problems at every possible turn. But their philosophy, their musical philosophy, was very close. I think I don't necessarily see them as antitheses at all. I mean, in terms of license for the performer, I mean, Liszt wrote sort of fully notated scores that performers were expected to execute, as Wagner did. I mean, he was a tremendous virtuoso pianist who improvised as well, but he also wrote operas and oratorios, and the Liszt piano sonata was sort of this monumental work, which generations of pianists have tried to execute. Just the sheer difficulty of this music puts just enormous demands, and it sort of has a sort of a controlling, overmastering kind of influence on the performer. And in terms of Wagner, and especially his singers, I mean, the Wagner singing roles are extremely difficult, extremely demanding, sort of sadistic almost in some ways, but they also allow for an enormous amount of expression of individual personality, and they're great differences in terms of how singers have performed, Brunhilde or Wotan or Gurnemanz in Parsifal. So there is license in Wagner as well. And then when you get into staging nowadays, of course, this isn't something that Wagner personally licensed himself, but somehow Wagner's work has allowed for this space of kind of infinite reinterpretation, like almost no other composer, just in the sense that you can sort of do whatever you want with Wagner, and the music will somehow still work, And so, so I wouldn't necessarily sort of oppose them in that way. And they had some, Liszt was also anti-Semitic, and they had sort of more some negative traits in common as well. But it's a fascinating relationship. And Liszt died at Bayreuth in 1886, and he probably would have rather died somewhere else. that was his fate to die. And Cosima, bless her heart, carried on with the festival. The show must go on.
We have just a few more questions. Although I do want to make one quick comment on that. I know we've been going and going. How are you holding up, Alex?
Yeah,
you doing okay?
Yeah.
Okay. It just flashed on me when you were saying that the Wagner and maybe the Ring in particular, but all of Wagner lends itself to these reinterpretations via stagings. That Brecht is similar in some ways, like Three Penny Opera specifically. I've seen so many different ways that's been staged over the years, and Brecht seems like shouldn't be that way, and yet that text keeps renewing those texts keep renewing themselves in the hands of others too. And you have a little bit about the relationship between Brecht and Wagnerism in the book.
Yeah, I mean, of course, Brecht on the surface absolutely rejected Wagner and dismissed him as a sort of relic of the past. And yet, as so often, especially with these sort of early 20th century figures who made a show of rejecting Wagner, there is, a palpable influence nonetheless, I think, particularly in terms of the resemblance between the idea of epic opera and Gesamtkunstwerk.
Absolutely.
Common traits there. Joy Calico has written beautifully about this in her book on Brecht and opera. And so it's that sort of relationship. And you find something of the same with Joyce, where sort of they take something from Wagner, and in the process, they reject him and scorn him. So it's sort of this plundering, a little bit of this sort of plundering of sort of the old world, and really, what Brecht, the terms in which Brecht dismissed Wagner are very similar to the terms in which Wagner dismissed the opera, sort of Italian and French opera composers who came before him. So the sort of the weapons of this kind of polemic, were turned on Wagner by Brecht, as Wagner had done to others. So it's sort of that the anxiety of influence mechanism,
yes,
the just sort of this older kind of Oedipal
sins
tension.
of the father.
Yeah,
Yes.
I didn't talk a whole lot about Brecht, but there is a lot more to be said. And Kurt Weill actually had his own interesting kind of submerged relationship with Wagner as well.
Very interesting. I want to acknowledge that Kenneth asked, why so little reference to how musicians interpreted and reacted to the music? But you did answer that question. So I want to acknowledge that question. I don't know if you want to say anything more about it.
Yeah, I just feel like the book would have been 2,000 pages long.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's this what really makes the story interesting is that this goes so far beyond music and the sort of composers influencing each other, and this is the kind of phenomenon that you do not find with Bach and Beethoven. And I think when you get to sort of popular culture of the late 20th century, you could see a kind of similar phenomenon at work in terms of the effect that that the Beatles and Bob Dylan had, but with Wagner, just how he became so enmeshed in the emergence of entire artistic movements. Right. It's kind of a singular phenomenon. So that's just what I wanted to focus on, sort of music affecting non-musicians.
2 more questions. One, this is from Karen, and this is probably one I imagine you might get in every talk you're giving. In the vein of whether or not one can separate the art from the man, people agree Wagner was a raging anti-Semite, but is the Ring itself anti-Semite? Thoughtful, knowledgeable people disagree about the Ring. What are your thoughts? That's a huge question.
Yeah,
it's like, recognizing you can only say so much right now.
Yeah. No, I just every year, every few months, even there's a new essay that comes out or a new sort of treatment in a book, and someone makes an argument on one side or another, and I find each one persuasive to a degree. I mean, I remain somewhat undecided, on this question, or just sort of honestly, I'm confused about what to think, because these characters, Beckmesser and Meistersinger and Albrecht and Mima in The Ring, Kundry and Parsifal, perhaps, do match classic Jewish stereotypes of Jewish characters, Jewish people, and there's something there. There's absolutely something there, but I'm troubled by the fact that first of all, Wagner never said that this is what he was doing, and he was not the type of person to sort of
hold back.
Yes. So we would have expected there would be some clue, but of course you can say even if he didn't explicitly or consciously intend it, it can be there anyway. Right. But then, honestly, for a long time, this was not something that people were talking about or taking notice of. This idea that Beckmesser is an anti-Semitic stereotype, it's not something that even came up during the Nazi era. It's almost completely invisible, and it's really in the post-war era this began to be articulated. Albrecht and Mima more so. There certainly were references to Albrecht and Mima as sort of allegories for Jewish characters in one way or another. But again, it wasn't a dominant motif of discussion, even among sort of anti-Semitic Wagnerians and sort of extreme nationalists. It was mentioned, but it was far from being a kind of commonplace. And so you're off to this idea that it was unconscious on Wagner's part, and then somehow the reception of it, sort of the absorption of it by the culture, was also sort of somewhat unconscious. And then what is that mechanism? It's sort of hard to specify, really what is sort of going on there in sort of material cultural terms. but it is there still.
Yeah.
I do feel as though, you know, this is not something that's been imposed, you know, in a kind of, you know, retrospective way, that something like this was working away. And I've just never come across a sort of full, comprehensive kind of articulation of it, which is just sort of really, really satisfied me, you know, and yeah, just sort of continue to go back and forth.
I mean, I have two thoughts. One is Kundry is also something of like an Asiatic character, or East, I don't know, like just an other.
You know, she's assumed all these guises, you know,
yes.
through history, you know, but the fact that she has been condemned to eternal wandering because she laughed at Christ on the way to Golgotha. It's just that Ahasuerus, the wandering Jew legend, you know. But Kundry is also such a rich human creation.
Yes.
You know, it's just an astonishing character. I mean, Alberic is an astonishing character.
Absolutely.
Alberic is not a kind of unambiguous villain by any means. You know, if there's a single villain in the ring, it's Wotan.
Yes,
you know, Alberic,
absolutely.
Alberic has this dark righteousness when he delivers his curse, which is magnificent, you know, and Wagner himself identified with it. Wagner liked this character and sort of felt a kind of, you know, sympathy for him. And so, you know, even if these are, you know, on some level, you know, depictions of Jews or somehow sort of layered with sort of a sense of Jewishness, you know, they are not cartoon villains in any way. And so that just sort of adds another kind of layer of complexity to this question. It's just, it's just something I tried to go through it as fairly and as much sort of detail in the book, but I left it open, you know, and I think it's just for something for sort of each listener to come to terms with.
Last question is from David. Excuse my pronunciation, Tamulonis, I believe. I like this one as a final question because it brings us back to the music, and you know, let you do some of your Alex music critic magic. So, it is the quiet moments in Wagner's music that have moved and engaged me. The preludes in Parsifal, the Good Friday music, Siegfried in the Forest, and of course, his tragic recall of his time in the forest, those exquisite moments in Meistersinger, and the simple yet complex beauty of the Siegfried Idyll. How to reconcile these with the massive orchestrations and Wagner's general reputation as bombastic and napalm in the morning. That's me. And over the top. I just had to say napalm in the morning at some point.
Well, this is exactly why this work is so remarkable, I think, you know, because I mean, I absolutely agree. It is these quiet, small moments which just overwhelm me. One moment that I talked about in a New Yorker piece some years back and touch on it again in the book is at the end of the scene between Fricka and Wotan in Act 2 of Valkyria, which is the beginning of Wotan's downfall. All of Wotan's delusions and schemes have been meticulously dismantled by Fricka, and he's sort of beginning this sort of spectacular plunge into despair and self-pity. But as she leaves, it is a moment of nobility for her. She's sort of recovered some of her dignity, you know, and you hear that in the music. And it's also a farewell. We don't really know what's going on there in Valhalla for the remainder of the cycle, but it doesn't seem as though Wotan and Fricka are hanging out. And so it is a parting. It's the end of a marriage. And there's this little orchestral passage, which is sort of luminous and it rises and rises, but then there's also sort of a twinge of pain to it. And that's some wordless interaction between Wotan and Fricka. I think it also has to do with Brunhilde as well. I think at that moment, Fricka is actually looking at Brunhilde. And so it's a complicated human moment. But and these moments are just all the more piercing because of all the grandeur, because of this sort of huge apparatus and the entry of the gods into Valhalla and the ride of the Valkyries and the procession into the Wartburg in Tannhäuser and these, this is sort of, that's the outward, the ceremonial reality, but it's not ultimately what Wagner is all about. It's the foil it's the backdrop for these much more personal and piercing and very often quieter moments, and they just are all the more striking with that sort of grandiose backdrop, silent, behind them, and so that sort of that balancing of the grand and the intimate of sort of this, this cosmic, scale of history, with these just sort of passing moments of sort of fleeting, personal interaction. This is what makes it gives the work a kind of really a Shakespearean heft, or Aeschylus, or whoever you want to say. I mean, this breadth is just irreplaceable. I mean, it's just what I think it's why it's why I keep coming back to Wagner. I'll say that.
Beautifully said. Late breaking final question from Richard, and this takes us back to the beginning of the book, in a sense, back to the living Wagner in the very first maybe moments, or a little bit anyway. Wagner's works all seem to deal with the redemptive power of love. Do you think Wagner found this redemption in his own life? I don't know about love. I'm going to add to that. Do you think Wagner died at peace with himself? Let's put it that way.
There's something so elusive about Wagner's personality. I sort of hesitate to even say. Not elusive in the sense that he was, secretive and reclusive and taciturn. Not at all. But he was just such a figure in motion, and sort of seized by sort of whatever project and activity was consuming him, or even what book he was reading. I mean, the stunning thing about the Cosima diaries is just how much he read. I mean, it was just he was an absolutely voracious reader, and he was also welling up with thoughts. Whether they have value or not is another matter. And so that I just feel as though he died. He was in the middle of, he was writing this peculiar essay on the womanly and the human, and he was beginning to think about trying to sort of turn to purely symphonic or instrumental composition. Who knows whether he would have carried through from that? But it's a sudden ending. I think he was sick, and he knew that he was sick, but he just basically dropped dead. In the middle of working, and Wagner was an enormously industrious person. For all of his chaos and all of his messiness and financial turmoil and emotional turmoil, he got the work done, in an incredible fashion. Just and these impossibly ambitious schemes, which he brought to fruition. So he was just working away, and he dropped dead. Whether he was happy or satisfied, I mean, the relationship with Cosima was strange, and there was a great deal of tension there. Sort of just Cosima, he was an overwhelming and in many ways oppressive man, and she sort of suffered through it in a kind of seething way, and that was just sort of could very easily break to. I mean, she was a powerful personality in her own right, so she would talk back. But no, I don't think it was a sort of a particularly blissful atmosphere. I mean, there was just always this degree of disarray, around Wagner. But it just ended. I mean, the beginning of the book is almost a little bit of an oblique joke, because he does drop dead on the second page, and sort of we're dealing with the aftermath, of sort of who was this man? Really, not so much who was this man, but sort of what he left behind and kind of the resonances of the work. So I almost felt as though we sort of get him out of the way, which we don't. Of course, chapter after chapter, he keeps resurfacing, and we keep hearing his opinions on all different subjects and his relationships with people. But for me, it's the convenience of not having to write a biography, and I begin with the death, but I don't go backwards. I generally go forwards, and there are all these problems and unresolved issues with Wagner, which I just don't have to have the answer to, because that's just not my agenda in this book, and so I can sort of float these issues, such is there anti-Semitism, in the opera? Sort of pose the question, but I didn't feel obliged to sort of find my way to sort of hard and fast answer. But that's an interesting question. I don't know what to say.
I loved all the questions that everyone brought, and Alex, it's such a privilege really to talk to you and talk with you about this great book. I want to encourage everyone watching to buy the book. You can hit the little link, and it takes you to Town Hall's wonderful partner, Elliot Bay. So buy that book. You're gonna love it, I tell you.
I also have stuff on my
website.
I should say I have sort of a chapter by chapter array of musical examples, and also some additional visual examples, and some sort of attempts to sum up each of the Wagner operas and sort of give a guide to the sort of Wagner oeuvre. There's a compilation of bad Wagner poetry, which I have on the website, which is sort of amusing, and just a glossary. So I just like to mention that that's available in case you're reading this book and you want to read even more about Wagner.
What's the URL for the website? What's the URL?
TheRestIsNoise.com.
Okay.
And see the links on TheRestIsNoise.com.
It will never end. Wagnerism will never end. And we're very thankful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anne.
I just want to come in and thank you both so much for, it's always so enjoyable to listen to people who have such a depth of knowledge and passion about a topic. And thank you for elevating and allowing us to muse on something that is outside of our imminent present. I'm sure a lot of people came in feeling
I don't think I was expecting a wrap up of the debate, but
I know. No. I noticed. Are we off? Are we off now? Are we off?
We're not quite off.
Okay, yeah. I'm impressed everybody stayed, and in fact, you got 2 people came in the middle. So go, Alex! Woohoo! That never happens. Usually, I'm doing a Zoom or something, and like I'm watching the numbers trickle down. This one, everybody was.
Yeah, it's very, very engaging. Lots of great questions. So I want to thank the audience for watching as well. Also encourage you to buy the book. That's going to take you right. That button in the middle of the screen is going to take you right to Elliot Bay's website. You can support them as well. And if you want to support Town Hall, you can follow more of our upcoming events. You can follow the Scribecast channel, or you can donate on here. But again, thank you both so much. This has been really wonderful. And I hope that everybody has a great night.
Good night. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks, Anne.
Talk soon.
Bye-bye.